The CEO disappeared on the wedding day in 1978, 15 years later. This was revealed in the image of Dot just before the story starts. Wherever you are on your journey, consider this your sign to keep going. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of San Francisco as Helen Chen methodically selected vegetables at her local grocery store. At 58, her routine had become sacred every Tuesday morning, the same careful ritual of choosing the freshest produce, the way her daughter Sarah had taught her years ago. The shrill ring of the payphone near the store entrance shattered her peaceful morning. Something deep in her chest told her to answer it, though she couldn't explain why. Mrs. Chen, the voice was professional, measured. This is Detective Marcus Rivera with the San Francisco Police Department. We need you to come to Big Sur immediately. We've found something. Helen's hands began to tremble. Found what? A vehicle, ma'am. We believe it may be connected to your daughter Sarah and her husband Michael Sterling. The grocery basket slipped from her fingers, oranges rolling across the linoleum floor. 15 years, 15 long years since Sarah had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and her mother's breaking heart. What kind of vehicle? Helen whispered. A 1978 silver Mercedes, ma'am. License plate reads MSCEO 78. The world tilted. Helen gripped the phone booth's metal frame as memories flooded back. Michael's proud smile when he'd ordered that personalized plate. Sarah laughing as she called it ridiculously pretentious. The young couple so desperately in love, planning their future while his family plotted against them. Double quotes. Mrs. Chen, are you there? I'm coming, she managed. Give me the address. As Helen raced toward Big Sur, her mind churned with possibilities she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The cliffside road seemed endless, each mile bringing her closer to answers she both craved and feared. The scene that greeted her was something from a nightmare. Police cars, helicopters, rescue teams, all focused on a twisted mass of metal being lifted from a remote canyon. The silver Mercedes, once Michael's pride and joy, now a mangled testament to tragedy. Detective Rivera approached her, his expression grave. Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry you have to see this, but we need you to identify that's his car. Helen interrupted, her voice barely audible above the helicopter's roar. That's Michael's car. But as she stared at the wreckage, one terrifying question consumed her thoughts. If the car was here all along, where were Sarah and Michael? Helen stood frozen as the twisted Mercedes swayed in the helicopter's grip, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The metallic screech of bending steel echoed through the canyon, but all she could hear was Sarah's last words to her. Mom, we're going to be so happy. Detective Rivera gently guided her away from the recovery site. Mrs. Chen, I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions about the last time you saw them. Helen's legs felt weak. She sank onto a nearby boulder, watching the systematic destruction of her 15 years of hope. July 15, 1978. They were going to their honeymoon cabin in Carmel. Sarah was. She was glowing that day. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah had been 25, fresh from her accounting degree, when she met Michael Sterling at a business networking event. He was 28, already CEO of a promising tech startup. But what drew Sarah to him wasn't his money. It was his genuine laugh and the way he looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Tell me about the Sterling family's relationship with your daughter. Rivera pressed gently. Helen's jaw tightened. Richard Sterling made it clear from day one that my daughter wasn't good enough for his precious son. We were working class. Raised Sarah alone after her father left when she was 3. I owned a small laundry business downtown. To Richard we were nothing. She remembered the engagement dinner at the Sterling mansion, the way Richard's cold eyes had assessed her like she was dirt on his expensive carpet. Victoria Sterling had been politely vicious, making subtle comments about Sarah's background and whether she truly understood their world. But Michael loved her, Helen continued, her voice growing stronger. Really loved her. He didn't care about his father's approval or the family money. Sarah used to tell me how he'd take her to little diners instead of fancy restaurants, how he preferred her company to any society event. Detective Rivera scribbled notes. Did you believe Sarah would just leave without telling you? Never. Helen's voice cracked. Sarah called me every Sunday, without fail. She worried about me being alone. She was planning to give me grandchildren. Detective, she wouldn't have just disappeared. The helicopter set the Mercedes down with a thunderous crash. Helen watched numbly as forensic teams swarmed around it, searching for clues that might finally explain why her daughter had vanished from her life. Mrs. Chen, Rivera said softly, we're going to find out what happened. I promise you that. But Helen was already thinking beyond the wreckage, beyond the questions. Somewhere out there, the Sterling family was learning about this discovery too, and she had a feeling they wouldn't be surprised. The black town car arrived like a storm cloud against the desert landscape. Helen watched from beside the police tape as the Sterling family emerged 15 years older but no less imperious. Richard Sterling, now 70, still carried himself like a king surveying his domain, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the remote location. Victoria Sterling stepped out in designer clothes completely inappropriate for the rugged terrain, her face a mask of controlled composure. But it was David Sterling who surprised Helen most. Michael's younger brother, now 30, looked genuinely shaken as he stared at the wreckage. "Helen Chen," Richard's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. "I should have known you'd be here stirring up trouble again." Detective Rivera stepped between them. "Mr. Sterling, we called you here for identification purposes. Please keep this civil." Civil. Helen's 15 years of suppressed rage erupted. "Your family destroyed my daughter's life, and you want civil?" Richard's eyes flashed dangerously. "Your daughter destroyed my son." She filled his head with romantic nonsense, convinced him to make reckless business decisions. "If they're dead, it's because of her influence. How dare you?" Helen lunged forward, but David Sterling caught her arm gently. "Please," David said quietly. "This isn't helping anyone." Victoria finally spoke, her voice ice cold. "Helen dear, I understand you're upset, but surely you can see that Sarah was unsuitable for our family's expectations. Perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided if she'd simply accepted that." The casual cruelty of the words hit Helen like a physical blow. Unsuitable. She was brilliant, kind, hard-working, everything your precious family never was. She was a gold digger from the wrong side of town, Richard snarled, and she dragged my son down with her scheming. Detective Rivera stepped forward firmly. "That's enough, Mr. Sterling. We need you to confirm this is your son's vehicle." Richard barely glanced at the twisted metal. "Yes, it's Michael's car. The plate was his IDMS CEO 78. I told him it was pretentious." Helen noticed something strange in Richard's reaction. While Victoria seemed genuinely disturbed and David looked pale with shock, Richard appeared almost rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing for this moment. "Where do you think they were going that night?" Rivera asked. "Their honeymoon cabin," David answered before his father could speak. "Michael had rented a place in Carmel for the week." "But this isn't the route to Carmel," Rivera observed, studying his map. "This is completely the wrong direction." Richard's face hardened. "My son wasn't thinking clearly those days. Sarah had him completely under her spell. He probably took a scenic route to impress her." Helen studied Richard's face carefully. Something was wrong with his story, but she couldn't put her finger on what. His hands kept fidgeting with his car keys, and he seemed eager to leave. "When can we have the remains?" Victoria asked coldly. "Ma'am," Rivera said gently, "we haven't found any remains yet, just the vehicle." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen felt her world shift again. If there were no bodies in the car, where were Sarah and Michael? 3 days after the discovery, Helen stood in Sarah's preserved bedroom, surrounded by 15 years of frozen memories. She'd kept everything exactly as her daughter had left it, the accounting textbooks still stacked on the desk, wedding photos scattered across the vanity, the faint scent of Sarah's perfume still clinging to the curtains. She was looking for anything that might explain why they'd been driving toward Big Sur instead of Carmel when her fingers brushed against a shoebox hidden beneath Sarah's wedding dress in the closet. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was an expensive set of black lace lingerie still with tags attached. The price made Helen gasp. $300. In 1978, that was more than she made in a week at the laundry. A small white card was tucked beneath the delicate fabric. Helen's hands trembled as she read the elegant handwriting. "For our special moments together. With all my love, Oliver." Helen sank onto Sarah's bed, confusion washing over her. Sarah had mentioned someone bothering her before the wedding, a man who wouldn't take no for an answer, but she'd never given his name. And Sarah would never have accepted such an intimate gift from anyone but Michael. The bedroom door creaked. "Mrs. Chen." David Sterling stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to bother you. The police gave me your address. I found some things too." He held up a manila envelope. "Michael kept these in his apartment. I thought you should see them." Helen invited him in. Noting how different he was from his father, gentler, genuinely troubled. David pulled out photographs of the same lingerie set, taken from different angles as if documenting evidence. "There are letters too," David said, quietly. This Oliver person was sending gifts to Sarah for months before the wedding. Michael was keeping everything, building a case. Helen examined the photos more closely. In one corner, she could see Michael's handwriting, evidence of harassment. July 10, 1978. Sarah refuses to press charges but wants documentation. Who is Oliver? Helen asked. I don't know, David admitted. But Michael was clearly worried about him. Look at this. He handed her a typewritten note. If you marry him, you'll regret it. Some women need to learn their place the hard way. Helen's blood ran cold. This is a threat, it gets worse. David's voice was barely a whisper. I found a receipt in Michael's things. He bought a gun 3 days before the wedding. The room seemed to spin around Helen. Sarah had never mentioned feeling unsafe, never told her that Michael was so concerned he'd armed himself. What had they been running from that night? David, Helen said slowly. Did your parents know about this Oliver person? David's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. Mrs. Chen, there are things about my family, things I'm just beginning to understand. Outside, a car door slammed. Through the window, Helen saw Richard Sterling emerging from his Bentley, his face thunderous with rage. He followed me here, David whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Richard Sterling's footsteps thundered up the stairs like an approaching storm. Helen quickly shoved the lingerie and photos back into the shoebox as the bedroom door flew open. Without warning, David Richards' voice boomed with fury. What the hell are you doing here? Father, we found evidence, David began, but Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture. Get out now. Richard's eyes were cold steel as they fixed on Helen. And you have no business going through private family matters. Helen stood her ground, clutching the shoebox protectively. Private family matters. These are clues about what happened to my daughter. Your daughter is dead, Richard said with brutal finality. Accept it and move on. David stepped forward, surprising everyone with his defiance. No, father, not this time. Michael was collecting evidence about someone named Oliver who was stalking Sarah. You need to see this. Richard's face went ashen when David showed him the threatening letter. For a moment, his composed mask slipped, revealing something that looked almost like recognition. Where did you find this? Richard's voice was strangely quiet. In Michael's apartment. Along with these, David spread the photos of the lingerie across Sarah's dresser. Helen watched Richard's reaction carefully. His hands began to shake almost imperceptibly, but she noticed. He picked up one of the photos, studying it with an intensity that seemed wrong somehow. Father, David pressed, did you know Michael felt Sarah was in danger? Richard was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if struggling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Your brother made many poor choices in those final weeks. He was paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. Paranoid. Helen exploded. Someone was sending my daughter expensive lingerie and threatening letters. That's not paranoia, that's real danger. Richard whirled on her. Your daughter encouraged it. She probably led this Oliver person on, enjoyed the attention, then cried victim when things got uncomfortable. David's hand shot out, grabbing his father's arm. That's enough. You can't talk about Sarah that way. The physical contact seemed to jolt Richard back to awareness. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The preserved shrine to a young woman's life, the evidence of genuine love between Sarah and Michael scattered across every surface. You don't understand the pressures my son was under, Richard said, his voice softer but still menacing. The business decisions he was making, the power of attorney he was planning to give her. There were complications. Helen's heart skipped. Power of attorney. Richard's face hardened again, realizing he'd revealed too much. Nothing that concerns you. But David's eyes had widened with understanding. Father, what kind of complications? What aren't you telling us? Richard straightened his tie with sharp, angry movements. We're leaving, David. You will not pursue this nonsense any further. As he turned to go, Helen noticed something that made her blood freeze. A set of keys fell from Richard's pocket, keys with a small tag attached. Before Richard could retrieve them, Helen glimpsed 2 letters on the tag, OL. Helen couldn't shake the image of those keys from her mind. OL, could it stand for Oliver? She spent the next morning pacing her small apartment, replaying every detail of Richard Sterling's strange behavior. The way his hands had trembled, his too quick recognition of the threatening letter, and now keys that might connect him to Sarah's stalker. When the phone rang at noon, it was David Sterling. Mrs. Chen, something's wrong with my father. He's been acting bizarre since yesterday. What do you mean? He canceled 3 major business meetings this morning. Deals he's been working on for months. He's been making phone calls behind closed doors, and when I tried to listen, he was speaking in some kind of code. He keeps saying things like the situation needs managing and loose ends must be tied up. Helen's pulse quickened. David, I need to tell you something about those keys your father dropped. She described the OL tag, and David's sharp intake of breath confirmed her fears. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to. A dial tone cut him off. Helen stared at the dead phone, her heart racing. Had someone been listening to their conversation that afternoon? Helen made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. She drove to the Sterling mansion in Pacific Heights, determined to return Michael's belongings and observe Richard's behavior for herself. The imposing Victorian loomed against the gray San Francisco sky like something from a Gothic novel. Helen, that had only been here once before for that disastrous engagement dinner 15 years ago. The memory still stung. Victoria answered the door, her face a mask of polite irritation. Helen, what a surprise. I'm returning these, Helen said, holding up a bag containing Michael's personal items from Sarah's room. I thought you might want them. As Victoria led her through the ornate hallways, Helen heard Richard's voice from his study, agitated, urgent. The words that drifted through the heavy wooden door made her blood run cold. Expanding the search area. Need a comprehensive plan. Clean up this situation before. Victoria noticed Helen's attention. Richard's been under tremendous stress since the discovery. The publicity, you understand. But when Richard emerged from his study moments later, his face went white at seeing Helen. In his hand was a phone, and she could hear a man's voice. On the other end, young, nervous, saying something about the original location might not be safe anymore. Richard quickly ended the call, but not before Helen caught one more fragment. We discussed 15 years ago. What are you doing in my house? Richard's voice was deadly quiet. Returning your son's belongings, Helen replied evenly, but inside her heart was hammering. Richard's eyes darted to the bag in her hands, then to the phone still clutched in his grip. His knuckles were white, and she could see a slight tremor in his fingers. Leave them with Victoria and get out. As Helen turned to go, she heard Richard's phone ring again. Against her better judgment, she paused by the front door. No changes to the plan, she heard him say. Everything proceeds as discussed. Helen sat in her car outside the Sterling mansion for 20 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel. As she wrestled with a decision that could change everything, the fragments of conversation she'd overheard echoed in her mind. Original location. 15 years ago, everything proceeds as discussed. Every rational instinct told her to go home, call Detective Rivera, let the professionals handle this. But 15 years of unanswered questions and a mother's desperate need for truth overrode her caution. When Richard Sterling's black Bentley pulled out of the mansion's gates at 4:30 p.m., Helen made her choice. She followed. Richard drove with unusual urgency through San Francisco's winding streets, his normally careful driving replaced by aggressive lane changes and barely legal turns. Helen stayed 3 cars back, her heart pounding as they moved through increasingly unfamiliar neighborhoods. After 40 minutes of tense pursuit, Richard pulled into an abandoned parking lot beneath the Bay Bridge. Helen parked behind a cargo truck, watching through her rearview mirror as Richard sat alone in his car, engine running, checking his watch repeatedly. At exactly 5:15, a beat-up Ford pickup arrived. Helen's breath caught as a younger man stepped out in mid-30s, nervous energy, constantly looking over his shoulder. Even from a distance, she could see his hands shaking as he approached Richard's Bentley. The man climbed into Richard's passenger seat, and through her slightly open window, Helen strained to catch fragments of their heated conversation. Search teams are expanding the perimeter. Richard's voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. I told you this would happen eventually, the younger man replied, his voice higher with stress. 15 years, and you thought no one would ever find that car. Helen's blood turned to ice. They were talking about Michael's Mercedes. The original plan assumed the canyon wasn't accessible, Richard snapped. Those damn college students with their satellite imaging changed everything. What if they find they won't? Not if we handled this correctly. Helen leaned closer, desperate to hear more. The younger man's profile looked familiar somehow, triggering a memory she couldn't quite place. I've kept my end of the bargain for 15 years, the man continued. But if this comes out, it won't come out if you follow instructions exactly as we discussed. The contingency plan we established is still viable. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. This should cover any immediate expenses. Remember, if anyone comes asking questions, you know nothing about anything that happened in 1978. The younger man took the envelope with obvious reluctance. Richard, I have a family now. Kids, if this blows up, it won't blow up if you stop panicking and do exactly what I tell you to do. Helen watched as Richard started his engine, clearly ending the conversation. But instead of leaving, both men got out of the Bentley and walked to the Ford pickup. Her heart nearly stopped when she realized what was happening. Richard was getting into the passenger seat of the pickup truck. They were going somewhere together, and from the desperate urgency in their voices, it was connected to whatever had really happened to Sarah and Michael. Helen waited until they pulled out of the parking lot, then followed the pickup truck as it headed south on Highway 101. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she realized they were driving toward the same mountainous region where Michael's car had been discovered. Whatever Richard Sterling was trying to hide, she was about to find out. The pickup truck's taillights glowed like red eyes in the gathering dusk as Helen followed it south on Highway 101. Her ancient Honda struggled to keep pace as they climbed into the mountains, the engine whining with each steep incline. She'd never felt more alone or more terrified. The highway gave way to winding country roads, then to dirt paths that seemed to lead nowhere. Helen's headlights carved weak beams through the darkness as she navigated by memory and instinct, staying far enough behind to avoid detection but close enough not to lose them completely. After an hour of treacherous mountain driving, the pickup's brake lights flared red ahead. Helen quickly killed her headlights and coasted to a stop behind a cluster of pine trees, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it could be heard for miles. Through the darkness, she watched two figures emerge from the truck. Richard Sterling's silver hair caught the moonlight as he gestured emphatically at his companion. The younger man kept shaking his head, his body language screaming reluctance and fear. Helen crept out of her car, grateful for the soft pine needles that muffled her footsteps. The mountain air was bitter cold, cutting through her thin jacket as she moved from tree to tree, getting close enough to hear their conversation. "This is the area," Richard was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "The search teams found the car approximately 2 miles southeast of here. If they expand their grid pattern, they could stumble onto—" "I know exactly where it is," the other man interrupted sharply. "I'm the one who put it there, remember? You think I could forget?" Helen pressed herself against a massive pine trunk, hardly daring to breathe. "Put what there? The question is whether we need to relocate," Richard continued. "How deep did you 6 feet, just like you ordered?" "But Richard, it's been 15 years. The elements, the animals, there might not be much left anyway." Helen's knees nearly buckled. They were talking about a grave. They were talking about Sarah. "We need to be absolutely certain," Richard said coldly. "If those forensic teams find anything, if there's any physical evidence that could be traced back to us." "To us?" The younger man's voice cracked with indignation. "You mean traced back to me? You made sure your hands stayed clean, didn't you? Just like always. Oliver, you were paid very well for your services. Don't pretend you were some innocent victim in this." Oliver, Helen's mind reeled. This was the man who'd been stalking Sarah, sending her expensive gifts and threatening letters. But he wasn't just a stalker, he was Richard Sterling's hired killer. Paid well. Oliver's laugh was bitter. $50,000 to destroy 2 lives and carry this secret for 15 years. You think that was enough? "It was more money than someone like you had ever seen," Richard replied with casual cruelty. "And it was enough to keep you quiet all this time." Helen watched as Oliver paced frantically, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. "This wasn't supposed to happen. Richard, you said the car would never be found. You said no one would ever look in that canyon. Plans change. Technology advances, we adapt." Richard pulled out what looked like a flashlight and started walking toward a rocky outcropping about 50 yards away. Oliver followed reluctantly, and Helen realized with growing horror that they were heading toward Sarah's burial site. She had to make a choice: follow them and risk discovery, or stay hidden and lose the chance to learn exactly where her daughter was buried. The mother in her won over the coward, and she began creeping through the underbrush, following the beam of Richard's flashlight as it bobbed through the darkness. Every step brought her closer to the truth she'd been seeking for 15 years, closer to the 2 men who had murdered her daughter. Helen crouched behind a boulder formation, her breath coming in short, silent gasps as Richard's flashlight beams swept across the rocky terrain. The 2 men were now only 30 feet away, close enough that she could hear every devastating word. "This is it," Oliver said, his voice hollow with 15 years of guilt. "Right here, under that pile of rocks." Helen's heart shattered as she realized she was looking at her daughter's grave. The casual way Oliver pointed to the spot, as if indicating a landmark rather than a tomb, made her stomach lurch. Richard knelt down, examining the rock pile with the cold efficiency of a businessman reviewing inventory. "No sign of disturbance. The arrangement looks natural." "I did it right, just like you told me," Oliver said bitterly. "Made it look like a rock slide. Even marked the trees so I could find it again if necessary." "Tell me exactly what happened that night," Richard commanded. "All of it. I need to know if there are any details that could surface in an investigation." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession. 15 years in the making. "I followed them to the honeymoon cabin in Carmel, just like you instructed. The plan was to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Kill Sarah. Make it appear that Michael fought the attacker and died defending her. Helen bit her knuckle to keep from crying out. The cold-blooded planning, the casual discussion of her daughter's murder, made her feel like she was drowning in horror. But Michael wasn't supposed to be there, Oliver continued. You told me he had that late business meeting in San Jose, that he wouldn't arrive until after midnight. Sarah was supposed to be alone. What went wrong? Richard's voice was sharp, with impatience. His meeting ended early. He walked in while I was attacking Sarah in the cabin's living room. Oliver's voice cracked. She fought like hell. Richard scratched my face, broke a lamp over my head. She was screaming for Michael, begging him to run. Helen pressed her fist against her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she pictured her brave daughter's final moments. Michael went crazy when he saw what was happening. Oliver went on. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace and came at me. For a computer nerd, he fought like a lion. It took everything I had to overpower him. And then I strangled Sarah first, while Michael was unconscious from the head wound. When he came to and saw her body, Oliver's voice broke completely. The sound he made Richard, it wasn't human, pure anguish. I had to finish him quickly. It was a mercy at that point. Richard's response was chillingly practical. And the bodies, I loaded them in Michael's Mercedes, drove up here to the spot we'd scouted, buried Sarah where you're standing now, exactly 6 feet down like you specified. Michael, you told me to handle him differently. Yes, the family needed a body to bury, needed closure for appearances. You cremated him under the false identity we arranged. Helen's mind reeled. Michael had been cremated while Sarah had been buried in this desolate mountain grave, both murdered by this monster on Richard Sterling's orders. Why the canyon crash scene? Richard asked. Your idea, remember. Drive the empty Mercedes to the cliff, put it in neutral, let it roll into the canyon, make it look like they died in an accident on their way to the honeymoon. You said if anyone ever found the car, they'd assume the bodies were thrown clear, or washed away. It was a good plan, Richard said coldly. It worked for 15 years. Oliver's laugh was bitter. Good plan. I destroyed 2 innocent people because you couldn't stand the thought of your precious son giving business control to a working-class woman. Sarah Chen was going to ruin everything I built, Richard snarled. Michael had already signed papers giving her power of attorney over his shares. She would have had control over 30% of Sterling Industries. I couldn't allow some nobody from Chinatown to influence my empire. The raw hatred in his voice made Helen's blood boil. Sarah had been murdered not for love or passion, but for money and social prejudice. So what now? Oliver asked. Do we move her? Richard was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing options. No, moving her now would be too risky. If anyone saw us tonight, if the ground shows signs of fresh digging, then what's your plan? Richard's smile was visible even in the darkness, cold and predatory. Simple. You're going to confess. Oliver's sharp intake of breath echoed across the mountain clearing. What did you just say? Richard Sterling's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as if discussing a business merger rather than destroying a man's life. You heard me correctly. You're going to turn yourself in and confess to the murders. Are you insane? Oliver's voice cracked with panic. I'm not spending my life in prison so you can stay comfortable. Listen carefully before you reject my offer, Richard said, pulling out a thick envelope from his jacket. This contains $100,000 in cash, plus account information for an offshore account with another $200,000. That's more money than you'll ever see otherwise. Helen watched in horrified fascination as Richard laid out his plan with the precision of a corporate presentation. Here's what you're going to tell the police. You were Sarah's obsessed ex-boyfriend. You couldn't handle her rejection, couldn't stand seeing her marry someone else. On their wedding night, you followed them to their honeymoon cabin in a jealous rage, but I was never her boyfriend. The police don't know that. You'll say you met her at a networking event, pursued her relentlessly, became increasingly unstable when she chose Michael over you. The expensive lingerie, the threatening letters, all evidence of your obsession. Oliver paced frantically, his silhouette dark against the starlit sky. This is insane. Richard, they'll give me life in prison, maybe the death penalty. Not necessarily. Crime of passion. First offense, good behavior, you could be out in 20 years with parole. My legal connections will ensure you get the best representation money can buy. 20 years of my life for your mistakes. Richard's voice turned ice cold. Not my mistakes, Oliver. Your choice. You could have walked away 15 years ago instead of accepting my money. You chose to become a killer. Helen could see Oliver's hands shaking even from her hiding spot. What about my family, my kids? The offshore account will support them comfortably while you're away. Anonymous monthly deposits, no questions asked. They'll think you set up some kind of investment before your breakdown. And if I refuse? The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. When Richard finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Oliver, you seem to have forgotten who you're dealing with. I have security camera footage of you entering and leaving my office building 15 years ago, the night we planned this operation. I have copies of every payment I made to you. I have recordings of our planning sessions." Oliver's voice was barely a whisper. "You recorded us insurance policy. If this day ever came, I needed protection. The evidence clearly shows you approaching me with a murder plan, demanding payment for eliminating my son's unsuitable wife." Helen realized with growing horror that Richard had been planning this betrayal from the very beginning. He'd never intended to protect Oliver. He'd been setting him up as the fall guy for 15 years. "The alternative to prison," Richard continued smoothly, "is that this evidence gets leaked to certain criminal organizations in San Francisco, people who don't appreciate when freelance killers leave loose ends that could expose their own operations. The threat was clear. Confess and go to prison, or die." Oliver slumped against a tree, the fight going out of him. "You bastard, you planned this from the beginning." "I planned for every contingency. It's what separates successful men from failures like you." "What about the offshore money? How do I know you won't just disappear it once I'm locked up?" Richard pulled out a satellite phone. "I'm calling my banker in the Cayman Islands right now. The transfer is happening as we speak. The account will be in your wife's maiden name, Linda Morrison, correct? Even if something happens to you, we're able to access it." Helen watched Oliver's shoulders sag in defeat as the reality of his situation sank in. Richard had thought of everything, planned every angle. "When do I turn myself in?" Oliver asked hollowly. "Tomorrow morning. Walk into the San Francisco Police Department, ask for Detective Rivera, and tell him you can't live with the guilt anymore." Richard handed Oliver a written script. "Memorize this. Every detail, every timeline, every emotion. Your story has to be perfect." As Helen crouched in the darkness, watching two murderers negotiate the terms of a false confession, she realized that justice was about to be perverted once again. But now she knew the truth, and she had the power to stop it. Helen waited in the darkness until the pickup truck's taillights disappeared around the mountain curve, her entire body trembling from cold and shock. The weight of what she'd witnessed pressed down on her like a physical force. 15 years of lies, the brutal murder of her daughter, and now Richard Sterling's plan to escape justice once again. She stumbled through the darkness toward her car, branches tearing at her clothes and rocks threatening to trip her with every step. Her hands shook so violently that it took 3 attempts to get her car key into the ignition. The Honda's engine coughed to life, headlights cutting through the mountain darkness as Helen began the terrifying descent down the winding dirt road. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every bend in the road might hide Richard's Bentley waiting in ambush. It took 20 agonizing minutes to reach the main highway, and another 30 to find civilization. When she finally spotted the neon glow of a roadside gas station, Helen nearly wept with relief. The station was a lonely outpost on Highway 101, its fluorescent lights buzzing like angry insects. A lone attendant sat behind bulletproof glass, barely glancing up from his magazine as Helen parked near the payphone outside. Her fingers were numb as she fumbled for quarters in her purse. The old rotary phone seemed to mock her urgency as she dialed Detective Rivera's number, each rotation of the dial feeling like an eternity. "Rivera." His voice was groggy. She'd woken him. "Detective, this is Helen Chen. I need help immediately." "Mrs. Chen, it's almost midnight. What's wrong?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "Richard Sterling killed them. He hired someone named Oliver to murder Sarah and Michael. I followed them tonight to where she's buried. They're planning to frame Oliver with a false confession tomorrow morning." "Slow down, Mrs. Chen. You followed to where?" Helen forced herself to speak more clearly, though her voice still shook. "Richard Sterling met with the actual killer tonight. A man named Oliver. He was Sarah's stalker, but Richard paid him to murder her. They drove to Big Sur, to the burial site." "You followed suspected murderers to a burial site?" Rivera's voice sharpened with alarm. "Mrs. Chen, that was incredibly dangerous." "I heard everything, Detective. Oliver confessed to strangling Sarah while Michael watched, then killing Michael afterward. Richard has been planning this cover-up for 15 years. Where are you now?" "The gas station on Highway 101, about 20 miles south of Big Sur." "Detective, you have to stop Oliver before he turns himself in tomorrow. Richard is bribing him to confess to being Sarah's obsessed ex-boyfriend, making it look like a crime of passion." "Mrs. Chen, I need you to drive directly to the police station. Don't go home. Don't stop anywhere else. If what you're telling me is true, you could be in serious danger." Through the station's grimy windows, Helen could see the attendant watching her with growing suspicion. Her voice had risen with urgency, and she was probably drawing unwanted attention. "There's more," she whispered into the phone. "Richard has evidence he's been saving for 15 years, Rick Gordon's payments. documents all designed to make Oliver look like the mastermind. But I know the truth. Richard ordered the killings because Sarah was going to get power of attorney over Michael's business shares. Jesus. Rivera was fully awake now. Mrs. Chen, listen to me very carefully. I'm dispatching units to the area you describe right now. I'm also sending a car to escort you back to San Francisco. What's your exact location? Helen read the gas station's faded sign and gave him the address. Detective Sarah is buried under a pile of rocks about 50 yards northeast of where they found Michael's car. Oliver said 6 feet down, marked trees nearby. We'll find her, Mrs. Chen, I promise you that. How long before your people get here? 20 minutes, maybe 30. The units heading to the burial site will take longer, it's rough terrain. As Helen hung up the phone, she noticed a pair of headlights turning into the gas station parking lot. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the distinctive grille of Richard Sterling's Bentley. She ducked behind her car, fumbling for her keys as the Bentley cruised slowly past the gas pumps. Through the passenger window, she could see a pale face scanning the area. They were looking for her. Helen's hand shook as she started her Honda, keeping the headlights off as she pulled away from the station. In her rearview mirror, she saw the Bentley making a U-turn to follow her. 20 minutes until police arrived. She just had to stay alive that long. The San Francisco Police Department buzzed with activity at 3 a.m. Helen sat in an interview room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, while Detective Rivera coordinated the massive operation now unfolding across 2 counties. Through the observation window, she could see Oliver being led into another interview room in handcuffs. His escape attempt had been short-lived. Patrol units had intercepted Richard's Bentley just 10 miles from the gas station. Both men were now in custody. But Helen knew the real battle was just beginning. Mrs. Chen, Rivera said, entering with a thick file folder. We found her. Helen's breath caught. Sarah, the forensics team located the burial site exactly where you said it would be. We'll need dental records for positive identification. But, he paused gently, the remains are consistent with a young woman, buried approximately 15 years ago. Tears streamed down Helen's face, relief, grief, and rage all tangled together. After 15 years of not knowing, she finally had her daughter back. What about Oliver? Is he talking? More than talking. Once he realized Richard had thrown him under the bus, he asked for a lawyer and full immunity in exchange for complete cooperation. Rivera opened his folder. Mrs. Chen, what he's telling us is even worse than what you overheard tonight. Rivera pulled out a timeline chart covered in dates and notes. According to Oliver's confession, Richard Sterling first approached him in March 1978, 4 months before the wedding. Oliver was a small-time criminal with gambling debts, desperate for money. How did Richard find him? Through a private investigator Richard hired to dig up dirt on your daughter. When that failed, the PI mentioned he knew someone who could solve problems permanently for the right price. Helen's stomach turned. Richard had been planning Sarah's murder for months, not acting in some moment of panic. The initial plan was different, Rivera continued. Richard wanted it to look like Sarah died in a random street crime, a mugging gone wrong. But when Michael announced he was giving Sarah power of attorney over his business shares, Richard panicked. That's when the plan changed. Oliver says Richard became obsessed with making sure Sarah never signed those documents. He moved up the timeline, insisted it happened during their honeymoon when they'd be isolated and vulnerable. Rivera turned to another page. Here's where it gets really sick. Richard provided Oliver with detailed information about the couple's plans, their honeymoon cabin location, Michael's work schedule, even the spare key location. He'd been spying on his own son for weeks. Helen thought about Michael's purchase of a gun, his documentation of Oliver's harassment. Michael knew something was wrong. He suspected Sarah had a dangerous stalker, but he never imagined his own father was orchestrating it. Oliver says Michael actually called Richard the day before the wedding, asking for advice about hiring security. The cruel irony hit Helen like a physical blow. Michael had sought protection from the very man who was planning to kill them. What about the cover-up? Rivera's expression darkened. That's where Richard's true sociopathy shows. He had Oliver burn Michael's body at a private crematorium owned by one of his business associates. The ashes were buried in a pauper's grave under a false name, and Richard insisted she be buried intact in case her body was ever needed as evidence. To support whatever story he decided to tell, he kept detailed records of the burial location, even took photographs. Helen's hands clenched into fists. He treated my daughter like a piece of evidence to be filed away. There's more. Oliver has been receiving payments from Richard every month for 15 years, not out of generosity, but as insurance. Richard told him the payments were proof of ongoing criminal conspiracy if Oliver ever tried to expose him. Rivera pulled out a bank statement, 58 payments of $2,000 each, always on the 15th of the month. Oliver thought it was hush money, but Richard's lawyers could have argued it proved Oliver was blackmailing him. Everything was planned to protect Richard, down to the last detail. Richard even had Oliver use his real name when buying the lingerie and sending threats to Sarah. If the case ever came to light, Oliver's name would be all over the evidence trail. Helen stared at the documentation spread across the table. 15 years of meticulous planning, manipulation, and cold-blooded calculation. Richard Sterling hadn't just ordered her daughter's murder. He'd crafted an elaborate web of evidence designed to destroy anyone who might threaten him. What happens now? Rivera's smile was grim with satisfaction. Now Richard Sterling learns that money and power can't buy everything. We have Oliver's full confession, your eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence from the burial site, and 15 years of financial records. This case is airtight. The dawn sky over San Francisco painted the police station in shades of pink and gold as Helen watched through the interrogation room's one-way mirror. Richard Sterling sat across from Detective Rivera and 2 federal prosecutors, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in custody, his silver hair disheveled for the first time in anyone's memory. Gone was the imperious aristocrat who had terrorized her family for decades. In his place sat a desperate old man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Mr. Sterling, lead prosecutor Janet Walsh began, spreading photographs across the metal table. These are crime scene photos from your daughter-in-law's burial site. Forensic analysis confirms the remains have been there for approximately 50 years. Richard's lawyer, a nervous young man from the city's most prestigious firm, leaned forward. My client maintains his innocence. Without physical evidence linking him to, we have his voice. Rivera interrupted, sliding a small digital recorder across the table. Mrs. Chen was wearing a wire during their mountain meeting. Every word is crystal clear. The blood drained from Richard's face as his own voice filled the room. Sarah Chen was going to ruin everything I built. I couldn't allow some nobody from Chinatown to influence my empire. Helen watched with grim satisfaction as Richard's composed mask finally shattered. His hands began to shake, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. This is inadmissible, his lawyer protested weakly. Obtained without a warrant, Mrs. Chen was a private citizen investigating her daughter's disappearance. Walsh replied smoothly. No warrant required. Would you like to hear the part where your client discusses the murder details? The next recording segment was devastating. Richard's cold discussion of Oliver strangling Sarah while Michael watched. Brutal efficiency of the cover-up. The 15-year payment scheme designed to control his accomplice. Richard's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Richard wasn't listening. He stared at the crime scene photos with the expression of a man watching his own execution. We also have Oliver's complete confession, Rivera added, opening another thick folder. Signed, witnessed and corroborated by physical evidence. He's provided bank records showing every payment you made, documentation of your planning meetings, even the original contract you gave him outlining the murder plan. Contract. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Written in your own handwriting. Apparently, Oliver kept it as insurance. Very detailed instructions about making the deaths look accidental, where to dispose of the bodies, how to stage the car crash scene. Helen had to grip the observation room's railing to steady herself. Richard had been so arrogant, so certain of his control, that he documented his own crimes. Here's what's going to happen. Walsh continued with prosecutorial precision. We're charging you with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and about 6 other felonies. California still has the death penalty. Mr. Sterling, a lawyer frantically, shuffled papers. My client is 70 years old, a respected businessman with no prior criminal record. Surely we can discuss a plea arrangement. Your respected businessman orchestrated the murder of 2 innocent people to protect his business interests. Walsh replied coldly, then spent 15 years covering it up. The only plea we'll consider is life without parole in exchange for a full confession and cooperation in locating Michael Sterling's remains. Richard finally spoke, his voice cracked and defeated. Michael's ashes. Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, Section 12, Grave 847, under the name James Mitchell. Helen felt another piece of her heart break. Even in death, Michael had been denied his identity, buried like a homeless stranger in an unmarked grave. Why? Rivera asked simply. Why kill your own son? Richard's laugh was bitter, broken. I didn't want Michael dead. He was supposed to be at that business meeting until after midnight. Oliver was only supposed to kill the girl. The casual way he referred to Sarah as the girl made Helen's blood boil. Even now, facing life in prison, Richard couldn't bring himself to acknowledge her daughter's humanity. But when Michael came home early and found Oliver attacking Sarah, there was no choice. He'd seen too much, fought too hard. Oliver said he couldn't leave witnesses, so you sacrificed your son to protect yourself. Richard's shoulders sagged in complete defeat. I sacrificed my son to protect everything I'd built. The company, the family name, the legacy I'd spent 40 years creating. I couldn't let some working-class nobody destroy it all. Victoria Sterling's voice came from behind Helen. You destroyed it yourself, Richard. Helen turned to see Michael's mother standing in the doorway, her face a mask of devastation and disgust. David Sterling stood beside her, tears streaming down his face. I want a full confession, Victoria told the prosecutors. Every detail, every crime. I want the world to know what kind of monster I married. The formal interrogation room fell silent as Victoria Sterling entered, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of a funeral march. Helen watched through the one-way glass as the woman, who had once treated her with such disdain, now faced the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her life. Victoria, Richard's voice cracked as his wife took a seat across from him. You shouldn't be here, shouldn't I? Victoria's voice was ice cold, more controlled than Helen had ever heard it. Shouldn't I be here to watch my husband confess to murdering our son? David Sterling stood beside his mother, his face etched with the pain that seemed to age him decades in moments. Father, how could you do this to Michael? He loved you. He looked up to you. Richard's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he faced his surviving son. I never meant for Michael to die. You have to believe that. It was only supposed to be the girl Sarah. Michael wasn't supposed to be there. Stop calling her the girl, Helen said, pushing through the interrogation room door despite Rivera's protests. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was worth 100 of you. The room erupted in confusion as lawyers objected and detectives tried to restore order, but Helen didn't care. She'd waited 15 years for this moment. You destroyed my family because you couldn't stand the thought of a Chinese woman having influence in your precious company, Helen continued, her voice shaking with rage. You murdered 2 innocent people because of your racist, elitist pride. Richard looked up at her with hollow eyes. You don't understand the pressures I was under. The board of directors, the shareholders, they would never have accepted what brilliant, hard-working woman who loved your son more than life itself. Or was it that she wasn't white enough for your social circle? Victoria spoke quietly, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Tell them about the prenup, Richard. Richard's face went ashen. Victoria, don't tell them about the prenuptial agreement you tried to force Michael to sign, the one that would have given Sarah nothing if the marriage ended. Prosecutor Walsh leaned forward with interest. What prenuptial agreement? Victoria pulled a document from her purse with shaking hands. Michael refused to sign it. He said if he couldn't trust Sarah with his money, he had no business marrying her. That's when Richard's obsession with destroying her began. Helen read over the document, her anger building with each clause. The agreement would have left Sarah with nothing, no property, no alimony, no business interests. It was designed to humiliate and diminish her. When Michael gave Sarah power of attorney instead, Victoria continued, Richard went into a rage. I heard him on the phone that night, screaming about how she was stealing his empire. David stepped forward, his voice barely controlled. Mother, did you know what he was planning? Victoria's composure finally broke. I suspected something terrible, but I was too much of a coward to investigate. When they disappeared, when Richard seemed so prepared for it, I should have known. You could have stopped this, Helen said, her voice heavy with accusation. Yes, Victoria whispered. I could have saved them both, and I failed. I've been living with that guilt for 15 years. Detective Rivera stepped forward with recording equipment. Mrs. Sterling, are you willing to make an official statement about your husband's behavior before and after the murders? Yes, everything I know, everything I suspected, everything I should have done differently. Richard watched his wife's betrayal with the expression of a man watching his own funeral. Victoria, think about what you're doing. The scandal, the publicity, it will destroy everything we've built. You already destroyed everything, Victoria replied. The moment you decided our son's life was worth less than your pride. Helen felt a strange sense of closure watching the Sterling family implode. For 15 years, they had seemed untouchable, protected by wealth and status. Now they were just another broken family, destroyed by greed and prejudice. Prosecutor Walsh spread additional documents across the table. Mr. Sterling, we have financial records showing payments to 3 different private investigators, 2 equipment rental companies for construction machinery, and a crematorium in Oakland. We have Oliver's signed confession detailing every aspect of the murders and cover-up. She paused, letting the weight of evidence sink in. We have your voice on tape discussing the crimes, your handwritten murder contract, and now your own family's testimony about your motives and behavior. Richard's lawyer leaned over to whisper in his ear, but Richard waved him away. I want to make a full confession, Richard said quietly. Everything, every detail of what I did and why I did it. 18 months later, the morning mist hung low over Holy Cross Cemetery as Helen Chen knelt beside two granite headstones, their surfaces still gleaming with newness. Fresh white roses lay against each marker. Sarah Chen Sterling and Michael James Sterling, finally resting together as they had always belonged. I brought your favorite flowers, sweetheart, Helen whispered, adjusting the bouquet against Sarah's headstone. White roses just like the ones you carried at your wedding. The inscription on Sarah's stone read simply, "Beloved daughter and wife." Her love was stronger than hatred. Below it, the dates that had haunted Helen for so long. July 15th, 1978. July 15th, 1978. One terrible night that had stolen everything. But now the truth had set them free. Michael's stone bore an equally simple message. Devoted son and husband. He died protecting the woman he loved. Mrs. Chen. Helen turned to see David Sterling, approaching through the morning fog, carrying his own flowers, yellow roses, Michael's favorite. He'd been visiting every Sunday for the past 6 months, and Helen had grown to treasure these quiet moments with the brother who remembered Michael's laughter. How are you feeling today? David asked, kneeling beside her. At 31 now, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that reminded Helen painfully of his brother. Peaceful, Helen said truthfully. For the first time in 15 years, I feel peaceful. David placed his roses against Michael's headstone. I dream about him sometimes. He's laughing, telling me terrible jokes like he used to when we were kids. I think he's happy now. The trial had been a media sensation, dominating San Francisco headlines for 8 months. Richard Sterling's conviction on 2 counts of first-degree murder had sent shockwaves through the city's business community. Life without parole. Just as Prosecutor Walsh had promised, Oliver Martinelli, Helen had finally learned his full name, received 15 years with the possibility of parole for his cooperation. His detailed testimony had provided the final pieces of the prosecution's case, describing in horrific detail how Richard had orchestrated every aspect of the murders. Have you heard from your mother lately? Helen asked. David's expression grew somber. She's doing better. The therapy is helping. She's been volunteering at a women's shelter in the Mission District, trying to make amends in whatever way she can. Victoria Sterling had been destroyed by the revelations about her husband, but she'd found unexpected strength in facing the truth. Her testimony had been crucial in securing Richard's conviction, and she'd quietly donated most of the Sterling fortune to victims' rights organizations. She asked me to give you this, David said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. Helen opened it to find a handwritten note. Helen, I know my apology means nothing after 15 years of silence, but I need you to know, Sarah was everything good that our family rejected. Michael loved her with a pure heart, and I should have protected that love instead of fearing it. I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor their memory. Victoria, she's legally changed her name back to her maiden name, David explained. She doesn't want to carry the Sterling name anymore. Helen folded the letter carefully. Forgiveness would take time, but this was a beginning. A young couple walked past, holding hands and laughing softly. Helen watched them with a bittersweet smile, remembering Sarah and Michael at that age, so full of dreams and plans, believing their love could conquer anything. You know what the hardest part was, Helen said. Not the uncertainty, not even the grief. It was believing that Sarah had chosen to leave me, that she'd found something better and didn't look back. She never stopped loving you, David said gently. Michael used to tell me how much Sarah talked about you, how proud she was of the life you'd built together. Helen touched Sarah's headstone one last time. I know that now, and I know she died fighting, that she never gave up hope that Michael would save her. Even at the end, she believed in love. They stood together in comfortable silence. 2 survivors of Richard Sterling's cruelty who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. Mrs. Chen, David said as they prepared to leave. Would you like to have dinner this Sunday? I'm making Michael's favorite recipe, terrible tuna casserole he learned in college. I thought maybe you could tell me more stories about Sarah. Helen smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn in this cemetery. I'd love that. And please, call me Helen, we're family. Now as they walked back toward their cars, Helen felt the weight of 15 years finally lifting from her shoulders. Sarah and Michael were home, the truth had prevailed, and justice had been served. Most importantly, love had won in the end. Richard Sterling's hatred had destroyed lives, but it hadn't destroyed the love that Helen carried for her daughter, or the love that now connected her to David and even, in time, to Victoria. Sarah was gone, But her love lived on in Helen's memories, in David's determination to honor his brother, in the truth that had finally set them all free. The morning mist cleared as Helen drove home, and for the first time in 15 years, the future seemed bright with possibility.